Welcome to Live Podcast. As we journey through the Bible, we are officially starting yet another book, and that is the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is the third book of the Bible. From the beginning of the year, we started with Genesis, then we went to Exodus, and now we are in Leviticus. Leviticus has 27 chapters, and it was written by Moses. So let's start. Chapter 1. The Bible says, procedures for the burnt offering. Remember in the book of Exodus, the God had given Moses instructions of making of the ark and the tabernacle and all that other stuff. And then now we see the Lord giving them instructions on how they were supposed to do their offering and the sacrifices. So let's read. The Lord called to Moses from the tabernacle and said to him, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you present an animal as an offering to the Lord, you may take it from your herd of cattle or your flock of sheep and goats. The Life Application Bible Study explains slightly on the book of Leviticus, and it says, we may be tempted to dismiss Leviticus as a record of bizarre rituals of a different age, but its practices made sense to the people of the day and offer important insights for us into God's nature and God's character. Animal sacrifice seems obsolete and repulsive to many people today. But animal sacrifices were practiced in many cultures in the Middle East. God used the form of sacrifice to teach his people about faith. Sin needed to be taken seriously. When people saw the sacrificial animals being killed, they were sensitized to the importance of their sin and guilt. Our culture's casual attitude towards sin ignores the cost of sin and need for repentance and restoration. Although many of the rituals of Leviticus were designed for the culture of the day, their purpose was to reveal a high and holy God who should be loved, obeyed, and worshipped. God's laws and sacrifices were intended to bring out true devotion of the heart. The ceremonies and rituals were the best way for the Israelites to focus their lives on God. So at least Life Application gives us a very good explanation as to why the sacrifices were done back then and not now, because Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice. So we no longer need to continue doing animal sacrifices. Let's continue. So the people were supposed to present an animal as an offering to the Lord, and they should have taken it from their own herd of cattle, a flock of sheep and goats. Verse 3. If the animal you present as a burnt offering is from the herd, it must be a male without defect. Why did it have to be a male without defect? The Life Application Bible Study explains why there was a difference, because in the book of Leviticus, we're going to see the word sacrifice and offerings. And the Life Application Bible Study explains why the different words were being used. And it says, was there any difference between a sacrifice and an offering? In Leviticus, the words are interchanged. Usually, a specific sacrifice is called an offering. And in this case, burnt offering, grain offering, a peace offering. Offerings in general are called sacrifices. The point is that each person offered to God by sacrificing it on the altar. In the Old Testament, the sacrifice was the only way to approach God and restore a relationship with him. There was more than one kind of offering or sacrifice. The variety of sacrifices made them more meaningful because each one related to a specific life situation. And we're going to see that the type of sacrifices that the people were supposed to give. Sacrifices were given in praise, worship, and thanksgiving, as well as for forgiveness and fellowship. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus describe the variety of offerings and how they were supposed to be used. Okay, so let's continue verse 3. So the person was supposed to bring an animal, a male one with no defects, and bring it to the entrance of the tabernacle so you may be accepted by the Lord. Lay your hand on the animal's head, and the Lord will accept its death in your place to purify you, making you right with Him. Why did they have to do that? Let's read Life Application Bible Study, and it explains what did sacrifices teach people? Number one, by requiring perfect animals and holy praise, they taught reverence for a holy God. That's number one. And then number two, by demanding exact obedience, they taught total submission to God's laws. Then number three, by requiring an animal of great value, they showed the high cost of sin and demonstrated the sincerity of the people's commitment to God. By their nature, sacrifices required the use of all the senses in worship, encouraging a whole person response to God. Some sacrifices were voluntary, while others were required. The sacrificial system taught a combination of requirement before God, but also presented opportunities for heartfelt voluntary response to God. Okay, so the person was supposed to lay your hand on the animal's head, and the Lord will accept its death in your place to purify you, making you right with Him. Verse 5, then slaughter the young bull in the Lord's presence, and Aaron's sons, the priests, will present the animal's blood by splattering it against all sides of the altar that stands at the entrance to the tabernacle. Let's read Life Application Bible Study. It explains the significance of the animal sacrifices and what God was trying to teach His people. And it says, when God taught His people to worship, He placed great emphasis on sacrifices. Why? Sacrifices were God's Old Testament way for people to ask for forgiveness for their sins. Since creation, God has made it clear that sin separates people from Him, and that those who sin deserve to die because everyone has sinned, as per Romans 3:23. God designed sacrifice as a way to seek forgiveness and restore a relationship with Him. Because He is God, He is a God of love and mercy. God decided from the very first that He would come into our world and die to pay the penalty for all humans. This He did in His Son, who is still God, became a human being in the meantime. Before God made this ultimate sacrifice of His Son, He instructed people to kill animals as sacrifices for sin. So Life Application Bible Study explains why there was need of the animal sacrifice and what it signifies. Let's continue. Verse 6. Then skin the animal and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priest, will build a wood fire on the altar. They will arrange the pieces of the offering, including the head and the fat, on the wood burning the altar. But the internal organs and the legs must first be washed with water. Then the priest will burn the entire sacrifice on the altar as a burnt offering. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma for the Lord. If the animal you present as a burnt offering is from the flock, it may either be a sheep or a goat, but it must be a male with no defects. Notice that the word no defects is repeated also in verse 3 and also here in verse 10. We see that it has to be a male with no defects. Slaughter the animal on the north side of the altar in the Lord's presence, and Aaron's sons, the priest, will splatter its blood against all sides of the altar. Then cut the animal in pieces, and the priest will arrange the pieces of the offering, including the head and fat, on the wood burning on the altar. But the internal organs and the legs must first be washed with water. Then the priest will burn the entire sacrifice on the altar as a burnt offering. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The Life Application Bible Study explains verses 3 to 13, and it says, Why are there such detailed regulations for each offering? God had a purpose in giving these commands, starting from scratch. He was teaching his people a whole way of life, cleansing them from the many pagan practices they had learned in Egypt and restoring true worship of himself. The strict details kept Israel from slipping back into their old lifestyle. In addition, each law paints a graphic picture of the seriousness of sin and of God's great mercy in forgiving sinners. Verse 14, if you present a bird as a burnt offering to the Lord, choose either a turtle dove or a young pigeon. The priest will take the bird to the altar, wring off its head, and burn it on the altar. But first, he must drain its blood against the sides of the altar. The priest must also remove the crop of the feathers and throw them in the ashes on the east side of the altar. Then, grasping the bird by its wings, the priest will tear the bird open, but without tearing it apart. Then he will burn it as a burnt offering on the wood burning on the altar. It is a special gift, pleasing aroma to the Lord. That was Leviticus chapter 1, and those were 17 verses in which you get to see the procedures for the burnt offering. But question is, why was animal sacrifices important? Number one, Life Application Bible Study writes, animal sacrifices accomplished two main purposes. The animal symbolically took the sinner's place and paid the penalty of sin. Remember, in verse 4, it says, lay your hand on the animal's head, and the Lord will accept its death in your place to purify you. So the animal symbolically took the sinner's place and paid the penalty for sin, because clearly God hates sin. And number two, the animal's death represented one life given so that another life could be saved. This method of sacrifice continued throughout the Old Testament times. It was effective in teaching and guiding people and bringing them back to God. But in the New Testament, Christ's death became the last sacrifice needed. He took on our punishment once and for all. Animal sacrifice is no longer required. Now, any person can be freed from the penalty of sin by simply believing in Jesus Christ, acknowledging Jesus' sacrifice in his or her place, and accepting the forgiveness that Jesus offers. It's as simple as that. We no longer have to perform animal sacrifices because Jesus took our place. So what lessons do we learn in the book of Leviticus chapter 1? We get to see that the book of Leviticus starts where the book of Exodus ends. In Exodus, we got to see the instructions of building the tabernacle. And in Leviticus, we see God calling Moses into the tabernacle and giving instructions on how the people were supposed to present their worship. We see that God was very specific with the kind of sacrifice that people were to give. E.g., we get to see that he gave them instructions that it had to be a male with no defects. And this was symbolic to what Christ would do in the future. He is the Son of God, holy and without any defects. He is perfect. There were different types of offerings. We're going to see that in the next few chapters. In chapter 1, we get to see burnt offering. In chapter 2, we're going to see grain offering. Chapter 3, we're going to see peace offering. Chapter 4, we're going to see the sin offering. And chapter 5, we're going to see the guilt offering. The burnt offering was to make payment for sins in general. It was voluntary. The animal sacrifice accomplished two purposes. The animal symbolically took the sinner's place and paid the penalty for sin. The animal's death represented one life given so that another could be saved. We also see that God is holy and he does not tolerate sin. That is why the people had to sacrifice an animal to symbolically take on their sin, because sin brings about death. And then we also see that in the Old Testament, God designed sacrifice in a way to seek forgiveness and restore a relationship with him, because God is a God of love and is a God full of mercy. We also see that the offering to the Lord had to come from the herd of cattle or flock of sheep and goats. There was a cost involved. Okay, so that was Leviticus chapter 1. Those were 17 verses, and I'll see you again tomorrow as we tackle Leviticus chapter 2, in which you're going to see procedures for the grain offering. God bless you.